The Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games series is an interesting example of an unexpected collaboration between two video game giants, Nintendo and Sega. While the two companies used to compete fiercely in the console market, that is all now a thing of the past, and fans have been able to pit the video game icons of the Mario universe against those of the Sonic universe. And while the series had a great start, its future looks rather bleak. It all began in 2007, when the first installment, titled Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, was released for the Nintendo Wii. The Olympic Games at the time were held in China, and this game was meant to give fans of Nintendo and Sega the chance to compete in Olympic events, using their favorite characters. There were 16 characters in the game, 8 from each universe, and they were assigned different types: power, all-around, speed, and skill, reflecting their abilities in the various events. So it definitely mattered which character you chose, as they excelled at different things. In more than 20 disciplines, you could compete alone or against up to 3 friends for gold medals. Since the game was released on the Nintendo Wii, it made heavy use of motion controls. For example, you had to move your arms in running events or aim with the controller in shooting events. In many ways, the gameplay was similar to Wii Sports, which was a huge hit at the time. A few months later, a different version of the game was released for the Nintendo DS, making strong use of the touchscreen. In addition to the regular sports events, the series also featured so-called dream events, which placed less emphasis on realism and more on fun. These included items similar to those in Mario Kart and added extra obstacles, not to mention that some of these weren't really Olympic at all. While the games received only average reviews from critics, they were major commercial successes, with about 7 million copies sold, 2 million on the Wii and 5 million on the DS. The games were a big hit. One thing was immediately clear: this would not be the only time that Mario and Sonic would face off against each other. 2 years later, the Winter Games took place, meaning that the second game naturally focused on winter sports. Players could prove their skills in events such as snowboarding, figure skating, and curling. The game's features and character lineup were also expanded. The game introduced an adventure mode, a festival mode, unlockable cosmetics, and more, and the number of playable characters increased from 16 to 20. Overall, it felt like a successful sequel, and commercially it was a major hit too, with slightly higher sales than the already very successful first installment. At the time, Nintendo's and Sega's strategy seemed pretty clear: capitalize on the hype of the Olympic Games and release a new entry every 2 years to coincide with each new Olympic Games. It sounds like a foolproof strategy. After all, the first 2 entries were huge successes. But as you'll see very soon, this is exactly where the major problems began. 2012, Mario and Sonic at the London Olympic Games was released for the Nintendo Wii and the Nintendo 3DS. This game once again built on its predecessor and added some new features, but at the same time, much of it felt very familiar. Since a large portion of the sports events were carried over from the 2008 version, the game ultimately lacked a real selling point, and it didn't feel like the developers had put all that much effort into it. That's not to say that the game was bad, but the disappointment among some players is understandable, as it more felt like a slightly expanded version rather than something truly innovative. On the positive side, the game did a good job of showcasing London and placing the city at the center, something the previous titles hadn't really done much. Still, it was questionable whether fans would buy the game again, when so much of the content was more or less reused from the previous installment. And this was definitely reflected in the sales numbers. While the first 2 games each sold around 7 to 8 million copies, the 2012 entry performed noticeably worse. With about 3.5 million copies sold, it was still a big success, but the fact that only about half as many people bought the game likely set off some alarms for Nintendo and Sega. To be fair, part of this was due to the fact that the game was released on the Nintendo 3DS, which not many people owned at the time, but sales on the Wii were also in decline. In 2014 and 2016, they followed the same strategy, releasing slightly improved versions of the previous entries, and the criticism only grew stronger. Beyond the fact that the games didn't significantly surpass their predecessors in terms of content, the controls became an increasing point of criticism. As early as the 2012 installment, people had complained that the motion controls hadn't been improved. Back in 2009, the Wii Motion Plus accessory had been released, making motion controls much more accurate. Despite that, over the years, no real effort was made to significantly improve the motion controls in Mario and Sonic, so the games continued to feel just as imprecise and unresponsive as before. Since some disciplines needed quite precise movements, this became a major issue. By that point, the series was no longer being released on the Nintendo Wii, but instead on the Wii U, so expectations had naturally grown. Despite the newer and more advanced technology, the series still played very similarly to earlier entries, and major innovations were lacking. As a result, fans lost interest in the series over time. While the earlier games sold about 7 to 8 million copies, the newer titles only managed about 1 to 2 million. However, this was also largely due to Nintendo's consoles struggling at the time. While the Nintendo 3DS, although less successful than the DS, still sold well, the situation was very different for the Wii U. About 100 million people owned a Wii, while the Wii U's appeal was drastically lower, selling only about 13.5 million. So it's no surprise that the market for these games became much smaller. After that, the future of the series became very uncertain. For the 2018 Olympic Games, no Mario and Sonic title was released for the first time since the series first launched. The reason appears to be that Sega was unable to secure the license for that year, which instead went to Ubisoft. Ubisoft used that license to release an expansion for their open-world action sports game Steep, which also fit well with the Winter Olympics. Meanwhile, the future of the Mario and Sonic series was very unclear. With declining sales and a lack of innovation, it seemed quite possible that the developers had already given up on it. All the more surprising then was the release of what would become the most recent Mario and Sonic game in 2020. The Olympic Games, although postponed to the following year, were fittingly held in Tokyo, Japan, and this once beloved series also came to an end here. With about 1 million copies sold, the game set another negative record, despite being released on the very popular Nintendo Switch. The classic 2D mode was actually a nice addition, but overall the game failed to win over as many players as the earlier entries in the series. When no new installments appeared in either 2022 or 2024, it became increasingly clear that this likely marked the end of the series. Sometime later, this was officially confirmed. The Olympic Committee reportedly chose to not grant the license anymore, as they were instead more interested in esports and NFTs. Even though this reason for the end of the series is quite disappointing, I mean, NFTs, really? It likely would have happened sooner or later anyway. While the first two installments provided a really strong foundation, it simply wasn't built upon enough, and a lot of potential was left unused. This became increasingly noticeable to fans over time, causing the original hype surrounding the series to fade quite quickly. In conclusion, the end of the series is unfortunate, but by no means surprising. To be fair, since the games were based on the Olympic Games, there were certainly some limitations when it came to innovation, as they had to stay true to the real-world sports. However, the series did show, through the Dream events and the Classic mode, that it was still possible to include creative and fun bonus content. So while it's sad that the long-running collaboration between Mario and Sonic had to come to an end, it's also questionable whether the Olympic Committee's NFT and esports strategy will really succeed. But who knows, maybe we'll see the return of Mario and Sonic in a game someday again.